Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you around the globe. Everyone attending today's webinar, we welcome you to the 9th in the series launched in April 2020 by the World Commission on Environmental Law, WCEL, of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Welcome and aloha from my home in Hawaii. My name is Denise Antolini. I am a professor of law at the University of Hawaii, William S. Richardson School of Law, and I am honored to serve as the Deputy Chair of the World Commission on Environmental Law. On behalf of WCEL, I want to express our gratitude to all of the speakers, the co-hosts, organizers, and all of the participants who have joined us for this 9th webinar in the WCEL webinar series. We are particularly delighted today to have as co-sponsors for the webinar, the Iucn World Commission on Protected Areas. You will hear from the distinguished chair of the commission, Dr. Cathy Mckinnon, in just a few minutes. This webinar is also co-hosted today by the Inter-American Institute on Justice and Sustainability. I want to thank two founders of IIJS, Maria Amparo Alban, one of our speakers, and Claudia DeVint, a member of the WCEL Steering Committee, for their invaluable help in organizing the webinar, which has a first-rate lineup of speakers. I will be introducing you to WCEL now and then covering some logistics for a few minutes before turning it over to my colleague, WCEL Chair, Justice Antonio Benjamin. He will introduce Dr. Mckinnon, who will then turn the session over to our moderator for today's webinar, Professor Simi Payne, who is an associate professor at Rutgers Law School and chair of the WCEL Specialist Group on Oceans, Coasts, and Coral Reefs. The World Commission on Environmental Law is one of the 6 expert volunteer commissions of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. WCEL is a volunteer network of environmental law and policy experts from all regions of the world who volunteer their knowledge and services to IUCN activities and other partners. We have over 1,300 members, many of whom are attending today's webinar, which has over 270 participants registered from around the world. Please go to our website. You can find the link in the chat box for more information, news, resources, a lecture series, and recordings of past webinars. As many of you know, WCEL had planned to host in March 2020, which seems so long ago, the Second World Environmental Law Congress, along with many partners such as the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment, United Nations Environment Program, and others during a full week of events in Rio de Janeiro. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, like many other organizations around the world, and like the IUCN World Conservation Congress, these events unfortunately had to be postponed to a future date. But while in-person congresses and conferences are not possible right now for many of us, our global conservation community and the entire field of environmental law must not stop addressing the multiple national, local, international crises that continue. So this webinar series was created to keep the momentum going toward that dialogue, toward a better world, to engage you, our members, partners, and colleagues from around the globe in these urgent conversations to allow us to share the amazing expertise of our members and partners and to continue to press forward on a just transformation of conservation law and policy. So topics like today's webinar and the upcoming webinars that we have planned focusing on Africa will help us keep hope alive for the rule of law and a better world. So now let me explain some of the Zoom webinar functions for the attendees. For those of you who are attending today, please go to the bottom of your screen now and you can open your chat box. We will be posting information and links for you from time to time during today's webinar, and we will use that chat box to communicate to you. If you would like to communicate to us, open the Q&A box. You can open that now at the bottom of your screen to communicate with us anytime during the webinar. You can alert us to technical issues, but most importantly, we hope as the webinar goes on that you will type short questions at any time into the Q&A box. We will consolidate those questions for a Q&A session at the end, which will be managed by our moderator, Professor Payne. A note about recording. We are recording this webinar, so we can share that recording with you and post it on our website. We will post the PowerPoints and other materials in about 1 week, so that anyone who is registered and anyone who goes to our website can find those resources. We encourage you to share those with colleagues. It is intended to be a public educational resource, along with our other webinars and our lecture series. Before I fade into the background in just a minute, I want to acknowledge the assistance today of our staff behind the scenes. Emily Gaskin, an environmental lawyer, is the executive officer for WCEL. And has played a huge role in organizing these webinars and getting us all ready for today. And João Recio Blanco is the director of the Ocean Program at our partner, the Environmental Law Institute. So we thank Emily and João for their assistance today with the session. And they will be in the background, but playing an invaluable role. Also in the background, playing a very critical role, are 4 professional interpreters, all of whom have expertise in environmental law. Luciana Ogando and Etienne Van Damme will be interpreting in French. Claude Arrault and Camila Oyan will be interpreting in Spanish. If you have not already turned on your interpretation, you just go to the bottom of your screen, select the globe icon, and you can at any time select the language of your choice. Last, I must add that the views expressed today represent the individual speaker's views and not any official position of the Iucn, either of the 2 commissions or the co-sponsors. The webinar is purely educational and we hope inspirational. Now I'm very pleased to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Justice Antonio Benjamin, the chair of the World Commission on Environmental Law for the past 8+ years. Justice Benjamin is on the High Court of Brazil, the STJ, and he is a world-recognized jurist and leader in the field of environmental law. We are so grateful he could join us today to give brief opening remarks and to introduce Dr. McKinnon. Antonio, it's all yours.
Thank you, Denise. I'm so pleased to be able to join all of you in this webinar, in a long series, continuing series that WCEL has been putting together, and now an effort led by my dear friend, Professor Denise Antolini. Perhaps I should begin with a little bit of a short history of how this webinar came to life. It all began when I was contacted by my dear friend Maria Amparo. She thought that the Galapagos should be included in another webinar that WCEL was organizing and had already advertised on the Pacific. And of course, Galapagos is in the Pacific, on the other side of the Pacific, not in Oceania. And that first webinar was organized by our colleague Maria Moavesi. Unfortunately, it was not possible to include Maria Amparo with enough time for her to raise the perspective from this side of the Pacific. And then I suggested that we organize a webinar specifically looking at oceans, but more from a fishing perspective. And that's how we began. My colleague Denise Antolini has already thanked a number of people including Emily Gaskin. But let me also thank Maria Amparo for taking the lead together with Claudia de Wind on this, and of course with the great contribution of my dear friend, Professor Niloufer Ora, and the other colleagues from WCEL. All that having Professor Denise Antolini not just in the background, but involved with everything. And no wonder we have a superb event that we are part of today. My task is one of the easiest, which is first something I did, probably in an incomplete manner, to thank people that have been working in putting together this fantastic webinar. The second task is to introduce my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Cathy Mckinnon. She is, how should I say, she is something. She is a British zoologist, chair of Iucn World Commission on Protected Areas. And that would be already enough on the plate. But Cathy has worked all over the world in her capacity as a senior staff person in the World Bank. She worked in Africa, in Asia, Central and Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union, and spent 10 years in Indonesia, or almost 10 years in that fabulous country. So we have somebody here that really has an understanding of biodiversity, but not just in the local garden, but or in her country or in her continent, but the global perspective of the issues that we face with biodiversity, and in particular with protected areas. She has authored or co-authored over 100 scientific books and publications. I will not even volunteer to read 10% of that because it would take many years of my life. But this shows the extraordinary colleague that we have here today as a co-sponsor. Two commissions working together, one coming from hard science, the other one from law and social science, for the benefit of protected areas. My last word is on the topic that we will be discussing, which is much beyond my area of expertise. I was born and grew up almost 500 kilometers away from the ocean. And my first experience with the ocean was at the age of probably 8 or 9. And it was not a very pleasant one because the first wave completely made me completely collapse. And I have this very, very vivid memory from my first encounter with this big ocean or big lake, as I told my father. Jokes aside, I think oceans and terrestrial ecosystems, from a legal perspective, face one challenge one macro or major challenge that we have all to agree on. And the challenge is to make sure that nobody thinks that he or she is entitled to a right to destroy the foundations of biodiversity. No natural or legal person, including states, has a right to bring species to the brink of extinction, and even worse, to take those species to extinction as it has happened. So I think this is a departure point that connects all of us, that there is no such a right. And in fact, there is on the opposite side an obligation of you, and if you want, a moral responsibility, but also a legal obligation to avoid taking a species to the brink of extinction. And this applies to all human activities, that directly or indirectly affects natural resources or the community of life, to use a more poetic but also legal concept. And this includes, of course, fishing. We all depend on fishing, but fishing is a tool for survival of humanity, but also a tool that has to respect the moral and the legal need to secure the survival of all species in the oceans, from sharks all the way down to the microorganisms that allow us to live in this little but magnificent planet. With that note, I would like to ask my colleague, dear friend, my sister, Cathy Mckinnon, to lead from now on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. I have the honor to be the chair of the Iucn World Commission on Protected Areas, and it's a great pleasure to take part in this webinar, even though it's only virtual. WCPA celebrates its 60th anniversary this year. It's a volunteer network of protected area practitioners, more than 3,000 members in 140 countries, working at the forefront of global action on protected areas, both terrestrial and marine. WCPA works closely with the IUCN Secretariat through the Global Protected Areas Program, Marine and Polar Programs, and the World Heritage Programs, as well as with the 5 other IUCN commissions. WCPA works to help governments and others plan and manage protected areas by strengthening capacity and promoting good practice, including awareness of the role of protected areas as natural solutions to global challenges, challenges such as climate change, disaster risk reduction, and food security. As Antonio has said, we are facing a major crisis in the world's oceans. Climate change is leading to ocean warming, ocean acidification, and deoxygenation. And marine life is further threatened by marine plastics and exploitation, deep sea mining, and overfishing. As the climate and biodiversity worsen, marine protected areas are critically important in this time of ocean change to build resilience, protect biodiversity, and ecosystem services. We also know that well-protected marine protected areas act as recruitment sources for fish stocks and increase fishery yields in surrounding waters. Science tells us that to protect marine biodiversity, we need a globally representative system of marine protected areas that extends into and includes the 2/3 of the ocean that are beyond national boundaries. We also need to consider connectivity and adopt measures to conserve species and ecosystems that extend beyond protected area boundaries. In 2010, the parties to the Biodiversity Convention made some serious commitments. Aichi Target 11 committed to well-connected networks of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures across 10% of the ocean. In 2014, the World Parks Congress went further and called for 30% of the oceans to be included in marine protected areas. This was then embedded in an IUCN resolution in 2016 at the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii. The new Global Biodiversity Framework under the CPD, currently under negotiation, is likely to call for 30% of marine areas to be protected by 2030. And even with 30% protection, we will still need more sustainable management across the whole ocean. Since 2010, there's been a big expansion in marine protected areas, with some very large new areas created. Today, approximately 7.9% of the marine realm is included in protected areas, not quite the 10% necessary to achieve the AIHE target. But it's not enough to simply call for increased coverage. Marine protected areas need to be effective in delivering biodiversity conservation. The first step is to ensure that existing and any new protected areas are well protected and effectively managed. While marine protected area coverage is reported at 7.9%, according to the MPA Atlas, only 2.6% of our seas are in highly protected marine protected areas. Threats from fishing are a large part of the problem. That includes both legal fishing, often allowed at unsustainable levels, and illegal fishing, the topic of this seminar. Even World Heritage Sites, the absolute jewels of the ocean, sites such as the Galapagos, are threatened by unchecked fishing. If we want to protect marine life, countries need to go much further and make tough decisions. Now is the time to take precautionary action to ensure a healthy, productive, and resilient ocean, even in the face of pressure from the fishing and other industries. In this context, today's discussion is very timely. WCPA is delighted to partner with our sister commission, WCEL, and the Inter-American Institute on Justice and Sustainability to present today's webinar. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Simi Payne. Simi is an associate professor at Rutgers University, focusing on international and environmental law. She is the chair of the IUCN WCEL Specialist Group on Oceans, Coasts, and Coral Reefs, so extremely well qualified to moderate this discussion. She has appeared at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea on behalf of IUCN. As legal counsel with the UN Security Council's UN Compensation Commission in Geneva, she participated in landmark decisions on the legal responsibility of aggressor states for the restoration and remediation of damage to the environment from armed conflict. Simi, I welcome you to this discussion and hand over to you for what I believe will be a very interesting panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy, for that introduction, and thank you so much for the perspective that you have framed these issues with, the wide-ranging challenges that we face. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the panel. I'm happy to be moderating this session on high seas fishing law and the role of marine protected areas. Professor Antolini and Justice Benjamin have introduced the World Commission on Environmental Law. I'd like to say a few words about its Oceans, Coasts, and Coral Reefs Specialist Group before I turn to our subject for today. The specialist group serves as a key source of legal expertise on the marine environment for IUCN. We have over 300 ocean specialist group members in over 50 countries, providing pro bono legal knowledge to IUCN and its partners. Justice Benjamin has highlighted the tension between resource extraction activities and conservation of the integrity of the physical and living ocean. As Dr. Mckinnon has described, this is exacerbated by pollution, and as she has underscored, the need for a long-term vision and strategy is essential. The Commission's Ocean Specialist Group is currently participating in the negotiations for a new legal instrument for conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity as members of the IUCN delegation. And this is another place where I've been very happy to see both the commissions, the different commissions working together and blending their expertise with the World Marine and Polar Program back in Gland. Note that we may refer to the treaty negotiation that I just described as Bbnj, which stands for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. Our members are also monitoring and contributing to the work of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the International Seabed Authority, which deals with deep seabed mining in areas beyond national jurisdiction, the International Maritime Organization, which is particularly important for these issues in its role for shipping, and the regional fisheries management organizations and the Food and Agriculture Organization. You can find the recording of our webinar from last week. This was a joint project between the World Commission on Environmental Law and IUCN's Marine and Polar Program, where Dr. Lisa Levin, Professor Meinhard Doel, Mr. Glenn Wright, and Professor Christina Gerda explored integrating climate change into environmental impact assessment. This was the fourth in our joint series of webinars aimed at building ambition for the Bbnj agreement. A related briefing note is coming soon, and it will be posted on the website that we will provide you a link to in the chat. As an intergovernmental organization with special expertise in the law and science of the environment and the role of permanent observer to the UN General Assembly, IUCN has a very special role in the world. At the Bbnj negotiating sessions, the IUCN delegation provides information to states through side events, consultation, and contributions to the discussions. This engagement with the process makes the necessary bridge between the policies that IUCN develops and the policies implementation into law. The United Nations has been hosting the Bbnj negotiation since the first preparatory session in March 2016. Of course, as you can imagine, this was preceded by many years of work in which WCEL was deeply involved, especially through our colleague Christina Gerda, who you will be hearing from today. The formal negotiations began in 2018 and were scheduled to conclude this past March, but have been postponed indefinitely due to the pandemic. Ambassador Rina Lee of Singapore, as president of the conference, initiated a novel intercessional process this fall, which allows informal, that is, off-the-record, discussions to continue in an online chat-style format. The IUCN team is, of course, participating in the intercessionals as well. Thus, progress continues to be made on the four elements of the Bbnj instrument: marine genetic resources, environmental impact assessment, capacity building and technology transfer, and most relevant for our topic today, area-based management tools including marine protected areas. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who has also contributed for a long time to the development of all the background international law measures that have framed the Bbnj negotiation and who has had a wide-ranging effect on law of the sea more broadly, and who I had the pleasure of appearing with before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, as she led our team for that effort. So Dr. Nilofer Oral serves as the director for the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. She is a member of the United Nations International Law Commission, which, if you're not familiar with the ILC, you should know is an extremely distinguished appointment in international law. She is co-chair of the study group on sea level rise in relation to international law for the International Law Commission. She's well known to many of you as a lecturer for the UN regional law courses for international law and as a lecturer at the Distinguished Rhodes Academy for the Law of the Sea. Dr. Oral served on the IUCN Council, was co-chair of the IUCN Specialist Group on Oceans, Coasts, and Coral Reefs, and I'm very grateful for her work in leading that before I came to the role. She was chair of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law for 3 years, and she currently sits on the steering committee for the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. She will frame our topic for us with a presentation of the international law governing illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Nilofer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Simi, for that very kind introduction. And many thanks to the WCEL, my colleagues, and to all of you who are participating today. So I am going to talk a little bit about, it's a somewhat complex topic, but IUU fishing and international law. So today, high seas fishing is dominated by a small number of fishing countries, but their destructive impact on the marine environment is massive. Bottom trawling methods of fishing destroys enormous swaths of fragile seafloor habitats. Moreover, the indiscriminate taking of fish with massive nets destroys other marine life, what we call bycatch casualties. So while fishing on the high seas is a protected right of states under international law, this is not an unqualified right. States also have obligations. And I hope to outline today that high seas fishing that is destructive to the marine environment and depletes fish stocks violates international law and constitutes illegal or unlawful fishing. Now, for centuries, fishing activities have taken place in distant waters. Until the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, there were basically two maritime zones: the narrow belt of territorial sea, about 3 nautical miles, and the high seas, and the latter subject to the rule of freedom of the high seas and freedom of fishing. Now, distant water fishing expanded significantly after World War II with increased technological capacity. New technology, including radios, radars, sonar, nylon nets, and hydraulically powered gear. The expansion of distant water fishing and the increased capacity to exploit massive amounts of fish stocks was a central driver to the development of international law of the sea, as I will explain. So it's not a coincidence that during this time of expanded distant water fishing, President Truman of the United States issued the 1945 Fisheries Proclamation, sister to the better-known Truman Proclamation on the continental shelf. This declaration announced the U.S. policy of establishing fisheries conservation zones. This in turn influenced other states to extend their territorial sea limits from what was once 3 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles to protect the marine resources from distant water fishing. And this increase in unilaterally declared fishing zones against distant water fishing spurred disputes such as the famous Cod Wars in the Northeast Atlantic. Now, in 1958, states adopted the 4 Geneva Conventions related to the law of the sea that included the Convention on Fishing and Conservation of the Living Resources of the High Seas, an instrument we have forgotten today. This was the first global effort to regulate high seas fishing through an international agreement. The 1958 convention featured different forms of duties of cooperation, and it also included a special provision permitting coastal states to unilaterally take urgent conservation measures in the high seas. So we see that efforts to regulate high seas fishing dates back to over 60 years ago. Now, without question, the most important international legal response to distant water fishing was the creation of the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. The exclusive economic zone transferred broad swaths of unregulated high seas into areas exclusively under the jurisdiction of the coastal state with very broad powers, including to conserve and manage natural resources. In addition, the 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement was also adopted under the convention. It applies to some areas of high seas, but it's limited to straddling fish stocks, that is, those fish between the exclusive economic zone and the high seas, and it excludes certain species such as discrete high sea species. Now, my next point is that freedom of the high seas and fishing under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention does not mean states are without obligations under international law. First, Article 192 of the Convention imposes an unqualified obligation for states to protect and preserve the marine environment, and this applies to all maritime zones, including the high seas. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea has expressly stated that the conservation of the living resources of the sea is an element in the protection and preservation of the marine environment. Second, that the flag state obligation to ensure compliance with conservation measures is also an integral part of its duty to protect and preserve the marine environment under Article 192, and again, this applies in all maritime zones. Moreover, Articles 117 and 118 impose duties of cooperation on all states for the conservation of the living resources of the high seas. That states have an international obligation that applies in the high seas was confirmed by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in the request for an advisory opinion that was submitted by the Sub-Regional Fisheries Commission for West Africa. This is the case that Simi and I had the great honor of representing Iucn. So even though the tribunal limited its opinion to fishing activities in the EEZ, its findings, parts of them at least, are applicable to the high seas. 1, flag state obligations apply in all maritime areas regulated by the convention. This means the high seas also. 2, flag state obligations under Article 94, paragraph 3, even though it does not expressly refer to fishing activities, the tribunal stated that the flag state, in fulfillment of its responsibility to exercise effective jurisdiction and control in administrative matters, must adopt the necessary administrative measures to ensure that fishing vessels flying its flag are not involved in activities that will undermine the flag state's responsibilities under the convention in respect of the conservation and management of marine living resources. So we see that the 1982 convention creates a set of obligations for states that applies in the high seas and for fishing activities. What is missing are the details. So during the late 1990s, an important development was the introduction of the concept of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, in short, what we call IUU fishing. It is a relatively new terminology that has its origin with the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and it was to respond to the rapid overexploitation of toothfish. Now, the Food and Agriculture Organization is the principal international organization providing a global framework for IUU fishing. The FAO International Plan of Action to Prevent, Deter, and Eliminate Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing, which is dated for 2001, is the main framework. It also provides a definition of IUU fishing that has become quite widely used, but actually this is not a legally binding instrument. So very briefly, illegal fishing is that which violates laws and regulations issued by states, regional fisheries bodies, or globally. They include such as fishing without a license, using illegal gear, fishing over quota, or fishing prohibited species. It also includes, according to the FAO and the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the lack of effective control of fishing vessels by flag states. This is important. Unreported fishing is the failure to report or underreport fish as required, but is also a form of illegal fishing. Unregulated fishing applies to fishing activities that are not covered by any regulations, and this would apply to the high seas, areas that are not covered by regional fisheries management organizations' binding measures. So while high seas fisheries is considered to be mostly unregulated, destructive fishing practices constitute illegal fishing and breaches of state responsibility under international law, and I underline that. Fishing activities that employ destructive fishing methods would clearly be in violation of the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention. Now, the FAO has also developed a set of binding and non-binding instruments that are important for addressing IUU fishing in general, but also for the high seas. In particular, the Agreement on Port State Measures is the first binding international agreement to specifically target IUU fishing. It entered into force in 2016 and has approximately 60 ratifications now. We also have to keep in mind that IUU fishing is also a multifaceted problem that implicates violations of other areas of international law. The links between IUU fishing on the high seas and transnational crime are quite well documented. Human trafficking, forced labor, slavery. These are aspects of IUU fishing that have been very publicly, and may I say, horrifically documented in recent years. The UN General Assembly has recognized the potential connections between international organized crime and illegal fishing in certain regions of the world. Interpol has become very active in what it refers to as transnational fisheries crimes. So I come to my conclusion. The highly publicized incident that took place in the Galapagos, and which is the subject matter of the driver for this webinar, highlighted what is a chronic global problem of destructive fishing practices in the high seas and the need for regulations. In the development of the Law of the Sea, distant water fishing was a critical driver for the creation of the EEZ, giving coastal states broad competence to regulate and enforce laws and regulations for the conservation and management of living marine resources. But today we continue to face the destructive forces of distant water fishing, and now we call it IUU fishing. Flag states are flouting their obligation under UNCLOS and international law. It is a problem that has implications for human rights as well. We need to recognize that destructive fishing practices in the high seas constitutes IUU fishing, unlawful fishing, breach of obligations under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention and international law. What we are lacking is a detailed regulatory framework, especially for those areas that are fragile and vulnerable, such as the surrounding areas of the Galapagos. There is a need for the concretization of the obligations that exist under the 1982 Convention and international law. So the ongoing negotiations for a new international instrument that will provide the necessary legal framework for the international community to fulfill their obligations under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention to cooperate and protect the marine environment is absolutely critical. High seas marine protected areas are key tools, but it must also be accompanied with the necessary monitoring, surveillance, and enforcement capabilities. Thank you very much, and I look forward to listening to my colleagues on this issue as well.
Thank you, Nilofer, for truly expert, clear, and inspirational framing of the legal issues. You've shared with us the historic and historical commitments to duties embedded in the treaty system, reflecting their recognition by states who may, as you note, prefer to forget them. You've shown us how the international rules, which may seem abstract, apply to IUU fishing today in the global ocean, and the wider implications for issues that include international organized criminal activity and human rights violations. You've also shown us, you've pointed us to the path to addressing this by implementing some real change at different levels of law and policy. Our next speakers will help us explore ways to implement these obligations and to find a way to conserve all marine biodiversity and to ensure implementation of international duties. So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Robert Casir, who is Assistant Program Specialist at Unesco's World Heritage Marine Program. His responsibilities include following up on the state of conservation dossiers, implementing ecosystem-based marine spatial planning, and capacity building initiatives in World Heritage marine sites. Also working with the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission on the identification and documentation of marine spatial planning initiatives around the world. In 2011, he was awarded an Alfred Topfer Natural Heritage Scholarship from the Europark Foundation, and he obtained his master's degree in marine geology in 2010 from the Renard Center of Marine Geology, University of Ghent, Belgium. Robert, please speak to us about how the UNESCO Marine World Heritage Program can be a beacon of hope in a changing ocean and how it can take us forward to wrestle with these difficult problems. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that introduction, and congratulations to the organizers for bringing this great, for organizing this great webinar series. So I'm first quickly going to explain a little bit what it exactly means to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So when countries propose or nominate an area for the UNESCO World Heritage List, they have to develop a nomination dossier, which sometimes can take many years to develop, to compile and to assemble all the necessary science. It can sometimes get files that are over 2,000 pages, so it's really a big, not to underestimate. And in that nomination dossier, state parties have to justify why the area they nominate is they consider as potential World Heritage Site. And so they need to justify 3 reasons. So they need to justify why the area or how the area is of outstanding universal value. So it is this OUV, outstanding universal value, which is really one of the basic pillars of the 1972 World Heritage Convention. And for natural sites, there are 4 criteria of OUV. So it concerns geology, beauty, ecosystems, and habitat. And the Galapagos Islands, inscribed in 1978, is actually inscribed for all 4 of those criteria, although that is not a requirement. So for World Heritage listing, one is okay. So secondly, in their nomination dossier, countries have to justify or have to explain that the site they are nominating is the integrity of that site is covered. So integrity refers to if, for example, a waterfall is inscribed on the World Heritage List, then the nominated property, the area of the World Heritage Site, needs to also encompass, for example, the catchment area or the water that leads to the waterfall. That's the integrity component. And thirdly, nations have to explain and document and justify how there is a protection and management system in place that will ensure that those outstanding universal values, that those are protected for future generations. And once that is, so that the nomination dossier is then evaluated, including by Iucn. So Iucn is the official advisory body for natural world heritage to the World Heritage Convention. And then it is the World Heritage Committee, a rotating body of representatives of member states that then makes the final decision. And so currently there are 1,121 World Heritage sites on the list, and 50 of those are marine. So it concerns 50 marine sites, such as the Galapagos Islands, but also Fernando de Noronha, Tuataha, the Great Barrier Reef. Really, they are often described as the crown jewels of the ocean. But once a site is inscribed on the World Heritage List, this is only the beginning of the story. So once the World Heritage Committee meets annually, normally in June, July, all the journalists, the media attention goes to the new site. But what is for us most interesting and also most work, I would say, is the ongoing monitoring. So countries that have a site on the list need to submit regularly reports on the state of conservation, where they update UNESCO on how the site is being managed, about the threats they face. So there were different forms of this monitoring. There is sometimes regular monitoring. Sometimes special dossiers are opened for the World Heritage Committee, depending on the issues at stake. And then the World Heritage Committee also makes targeted requests and recommendations to nations based on their state of conservation reports to assist and to cooperate with those nations to improve the state of conservation if necessary. So this is about 150 reports each year that are being evaluated. And we can share the link maybe after the meeting, because all those links and decisions and reports, and for Galapagos, you can imagine, which gets, of course, it's really one of the jewels on this crown jewels of the ocean. So you can find all the records on the state of conservation reports, the state party reports with a lot of information. Those are all available freely online and are a tremendous data set for everyone. At the World Heritage Center, we have a marine program. So I work for the World Heritage Marine Program. And this program is dedicated to the 50 marine sites on the World Heritage list. And so our program has 4 key focused areas. So one is this state of conservation, where we assist with technical evaluation. We compile scientific information, sometimes we lead or we coordinate development of scientific publications, all in the framework of assisting governments and state parties on the state of conservation of their property. A second really important focus of our work is the managers network. So all those marine sites, I would say, those are really the dream jobs, because all of those sites are, of course, managed by incredible people on the ground who are on the first line of defense for those marine sites. And so we often bring them together, capacity building, international cooperation. There is a lot of cooperation happening already between, for example, in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, in Galapagos, in the Cocos Islands, between the West Norwegian Fjord and Glacier Bay, between the Wadden Sea and Bangladesh National Park. So this international cooperation is really a focus area and helps to replicate successes in other sites. For example, a couple of years ago, the Great Barrier Reef also sent a team to the Galapagos for 2 weeks to help or to advise also Galapagos Islands how in the Great Barrier Reef they had set up a compliance monitoring system with all the IT and the computer systems. And so this is one of those replications of success that we help to foster. Thirdly, we also, of course, as everybody, I think we focus on climate change. So we document climate change impacts. If necessary, we bring together scientists to look into some of those issues sometimes for the first time, as we did with coral reefs 2 years ago. And we also built a resilience and climate change adaptation capacity in the marine sites on the ground. And fourthly, which is maybe very relevant for this webinar, is we have also looked at possible World Heritage sites in the high seas. So in 2011, there was an audit by the UNESCO external auditor that basically recommended to look into this issue of why there are currently no marine sites in marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. So those 50 marine sites are currently all not located in marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. And from that, the World Heritage Marine Program raised resources to have some expert meetings, including with many many people from Iucn. I'm going to, and from those expert meetings, there was a major Unesco Iucn report launched, and I'm going to do some product placement. So this is the report. You can also find it on our website. So this report showed or looked at how World Heritage sites in the high seas could actually look like. So it's all potential, because it was a potential hypothetical exercise. So it was with scientists looking at the deep sea, looking at, for example, the dome in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, the Sargasso Sea, the Lost City. But the report also looked at possible legal options of how this could be possible. So we can share the links maybe afterwards, because there were several legal options that are being proposed, and also at some of the practical modalities of how this could actually happen was then also discussed more in detail with legal experts 2 years ago. So another product placement, a brochure, which we can also share afterwards. And currently what we are doing is we are bringing all those elements together of what has happened with Iucn and with Unesco, let's say the legal and scientific preparatory work for consideration by the World Heritage Committee. So they were, normally they should have met in June, July, but at many meetings, the meeting has been postponed for this year. But no new dates are not yet known when the next committee session will take place. And so linked with that, I also wanted to conclude with on this focus of international cooperation, is that the World Heritage Committee has also asked for the development of a World Heritage Policy Compendium. So this policy compendium is also on the website available, looks at environmental case law based on positions and requests over the years from the World Heritage Committee. And some of them also are particularly relevant for this case, because the committee has already requested state parties to work together, to cooperate, to prevent that vessels under their flags are targeting migratory species that are part of the outstanding universal value of some sites. So, so some countries are already working together on those issues, and for example, Galapagos and Cocos Islands and all the sites in the region are also who are sharing this World Heritage status are also have twinning agreements to look into how they can collectively ensure the safeguarding of this outstanding universal value. Thank you.
Robert, thank you. You have highlighted qualities of the World Heritage Program that I especially admire. Its positive approach that celebrates the jewels of our planet, its contributions through reporting, analysis, capacity building, and making information public, and the role of international cooperation. These are the most fundamental of governance tools, without which nothing else is possible. Alas, these are necessary, but not sufficient. Our next speaker, WCEL member Maria Amparo Alban, is a founding partner of the Inter-American Institute on Justice and Sustainability. She is an Ecuadorian lawyer with a specialization in economic law, international trade, environment, and sustainability. She has performed extensive consultancy work nationally and internationally on environmental law, environmental compliance, international negotiations, and sustainability and trade. She currently teaches environmental law at Universidad de los Hemisferios and trade negotiations at the University of the Americas, UDLA, in Ecuador. She will take us into the heart of the current situation in Galapagos and help us understand how we might achieve international marine protection, what the legal options are in the face of very serious challenges. Maria Amparo, please speak to us.
Thank you, Simi, and thank you all for this wonderful panel. I'm very honored to be here with all. I will be addressing the audience in Spanish, and I hope to catch Latin American audience and share our thoughts and be able to work later on this issue. I will be switching to Spanish now. La idea detrás de esta presentación y de este panel fue el poder estudiar y poder mirar la capacidad que tienen los principios internacionales de derecho ambiental y en especial aquellos que Ecuador ha incorporado a su legislación y aquellos que muchos países están reconociendo. En vista de que muchos de los estados hemos hecho un gran esfuerzo para proteger nuestros recursos naturales y sobre todo ecosistemas tan sensibles como es el caso de Galápagos. Ecuador es un país que ha hecho esfuerzos grandes en materia regulatoria, miembro de la Convención de Diversidad Biológica del 95, tiene un régimen especial para Galápagos desde el 98, es miembro también de muchos acuerdos multilaterales de medio ambiente, entre los que destacan CITES y la Convención sobre Especies Migratorias y otros más. Esta Constitución del 2008 ha incluido varias disposiciones y principios, pero también derechos especiales, como es el derecho de la naturaleza. Desde el 2012 ha ratificado la Convención del Mar. Este fue un hecho largamente esperado, discutido internamente, del que se espera tener también posibilidades de retroalimentar la capacidad de protección y también lograr coberturas de protección también para los recursos marinos. Y también, adicionalmente, desde el 2016, tiene un santuario de tiburones, una reserva marina especialmente dedicada al santuario de tiburones en las Islas Galápagos. Todos conocen la importancia que tiene Galápagos a nivel ecosistémico. Tiene más de 3.000 especies, más de 500 son endémicas, con una reserva marina de 40 millas. Y como ya se ha mencionado acá, es también patrimonio natural de la humanidad desde 1978. En este contexto de protección y de esfuerzos también que hace el país por mantener esta categoría, es un objeto de amenaza. Flotas internacionales que rodean el Pacífico Sudeste tienen operaciones cerca de las Islas Galápagos, en el borde de la zona económica exclusiva insular, muy cerca del Parque Nacional Galápagos, con lo cual ya en el 2017 se verificó un caso muy particular que fue la captura de un barco, una nave muy grande, el Iucn, dentro de la reserva marina, en donde se miró y se pudo evidenciar tal vez por primera vez para nosotros la magnitud que tiene esta operación industrial en aguas que son protegidas y el impacto, la magnitud del impacto sobre el ecosistema marino. Como miran en las fotografías, toneladas, ¿no?, de tiburones sin aletas, incluyendo tiburón ballena, una especie especialmente protegida, tiburones martillo que ni siquiera alcanzan el tamaño. Es decir, esto grafica la capacidad de devastación que tiene en el ecosistema este tipo de pesca y particularmente en un área protegida y una que tiene la categoría de reserva marina, por lo cual este caso fue un caso muy importante que se lo atendió desde la legislación ecuatoriana y se siguieron los procedimientos ordinarios que se tienen para el efecto, aplicando lo que tiene Ecuador, que es su legislación. Pero sobre el impacto es importante mirar, ¿no? Esto yo lo considero, y así también ha sido visto, un caso de aleteo de tiburón a nivel industrial, es decir, es una práctica depredatoria muy, muy grave que está dirigida a las especies de tiburones. De la totalidad de las toneladas encontradas, se ve más del 77% eran tiburones y apenas 22, un poco más de 22% pesca blanca. Variedades de tiburones, algunas, dentro de las cuales 7 estaban listadas en el apéndice 2 de CITES, 2 consideradas bajo amenaza y 1 bajo grave amenaza. Esto lleva a tener una idea de la magnitud de las operaciones ilegales, es decir, tanto en nivel de almacenamiento como la capacidad de dirigir estas actividades específicas a ciertas especies que son básicas en el ecosistema marino, sobre todo del ecosistema de las Islas Galápagos. Respecto a la capacidad de hacer cumplir la legislación nacional, Ecuador puso a disposición y el Parque Nacional Galápagos y muchas organizaciones, el Ministerio del Ambiente y la Fiscalía, tomaron acciones para dirigir el juicio, digamos, específicamente a probar la eficacia del Código Orgánico Penal y del artículo 247 que describe los delitos contra la flora y la fauna. Que categoriza y especifica al que case, pesque, capture, culete, extraiga, se encuentre en posesión de, transporte, trafique o beneficie, intercambie o comercie especies, flora y fauna silvestre, tendrá una pena de prisión de 1 a 3 años. Esto es lo que nuestra legislación establece. Y si es que los crímenes son cometidos en periodos de reproducción o vedas, donde hay anidamiento, incubación, partos, crecimiento de las especies, o si son cometidas dentro de áreas naturales protegidas, se aplica la pena más alta. El tipo penal que tiene la legislación ecuatoriana es una norma penal en blanco. Se remite a una norma técnica del Ministerio del Ambiente, nuestra Autoridad Nacional Ambiental. Pero por supuesto, a pesar de estas facilidades técnicas, digamos, la legislación existen al tratar este tipo de casos dificultades de orden probatorio, dificultades también como de implementación de los tipos que sean más adecuados para el ilícito cometido, como fue en este caso. Esto es algo que se tiene que ir mirando, porque los códigos, y sobre todo los nuevos penales que van surgiendo en los países, no están preparados para este tipo de casos, digamos, de la magnitud que se presentan con la pesca ilegal. Y esto es también una necesidad de reflexión a nivel regulatorio que surge en el país después de este caso, porque vemos que esto continúa. Claro, hemos visto desde marzo a septiembre, y este ha sido reportado ampliamente en medios, flotas pesqueras, también se cree de nacionalidad china, apostadas al borde de la zona económica exclusiva del Ecuador insular, donde se apreciaba, de acuerdo a los reportes, alrededor de 200 barcos de bandera china. Se creía por los reportes que estaban pescando calamar gigante, eso es lo que había sido reportado. En declaraciones posteriores, el ministro de Defensa de Ecuador, confirmando el hecho y haciendo referencia a la capacidad que tiene el Estado de monitoreo de estas incursiones y de estos apostamientos que se observan, pudieron verificar que se trataba no de 60 barcos, del tamaño que mostraba en la fotografía inicial, industriales, sino de 340. Y esta diferencia de datos correspondía a que los sistemas automáticos de identificación, los transponders que tienen los barcos, estaban desactivados. No estaban localizaciones de Nueva Zelanda. Y surge ahí una pregunta sobre la capacidad de monitoreo de estas naves. Estas prácticas hacen más difícil hacer seguimiento de la trayectoria. Se cree que son frecuentes las prácticas de desactivar los transponders. También es importante saber que estas instituciones exceden la capacidad de monitoreo de nuestros estados. Ecuador es un país pequeño, con recursos limitados también dentro de su capacidad de defensa nacional y monitoreo de aguas nacionales. Con lo cual es importante tener una mirada regional al tratamiento del recurso compartido con los países vecinos. Existe también apoyo internacional, hay organizaciones como Global y otras que pueden ser importantes al momento de monitorear, pero requiere o demanda ahora una capacidad de organización y de cooperación que no estaba prevista. Los sistemas de rastreo y de trazabilidad de la pesca deben ser el nuevo estándar de las pesquerías a nivel global. Y es importante que los países comencemos a poner más énfasis en los acuerdos regionales y en el manejo de las organizaciones regionales de ordenación pesquero, en el cumplimiento del plan de acción de la FAO que se ha mencionado y del código de conducta para pesquerías responsables, incluyendo este factor muy importante de geolocalización y de trazabilidad para aumentar la transparencia. Incluso bloques de países como la Unión Europea tienen programas específicos que alcanzan a nuestros estados a través de sus acuerdos comerciales, donde hemos recibido una alerta para aumentar las acciones sobre pesca ilegal, no regulada y no reglamentada, sobre todo que tiene en relación con el mercado europeo. Entonces, es un conjunto de medidas que estos hechos desatan y que llaman sobre todo a la acción de parte de nuestros estados. Pero también, por otro lado, llama a la necesidad de mirar el tema de seguridad alimentaria sobre los recursos compartidos, porque miramos que es importante que los países compartan una visión para que no se vuelva la tragedia de los comunes o no se siga en esa mirada. Y esta pesca de calamares gigantes apostados en el límite de la zona económica exclusiva ecuatoriana por parte de flotas extranjeras también despierta apetitos comerciales ilícitos, digamos, de parte de la flota pesquera ecuatoriana. Y recientemente la Cámara de Pesquería ha anunciado su interés de incursionar en la pesca de calamar gigante. Ecuador es parte de este organismo de la ordenación pesquera del Pacífico Sur, y debido al alto valor comercial que tiene esta especie en el mercado internacional y en los mercados asiáticos como China, como una opción de prevenir esa incursión. En fin, esa es una de las motivaciones. Esta especie de calamar gigante es altamente migratoria y es alimento de túnidos, de pez de espada, de dorado, ballenas, delfines y otras especies, siendo muy importante dentro del ecosistema. Para incursionar en esta actividad, la flota pesquera ecuatoriana tiene que adaptar su marco jurídico para poder comenzar su incursión en esta pesca. ya que es miembro del organismo del Pacífico Sur, modificar un acuerdo ministerial que limitaba esta actividad dentro de aguas ecuatorianas y, en fin, acomodar la legislación para preparar para esta medida. Lo que sí es importante en este tema es reconocer que la protección de los recursos marinos no se está verificando, a pesar de que los países cumplan e implementen los compromisos internacionales que tienen suscritos. Debido a la alta conectividad que tienen los ecosistemas marinos. Y este es un trabajo importante que se ha hecho a nivel científico en las Islas Galápagos con organizaciones no gubernamentales, científicos, para determinar una migravía o un corredor marino con Isla de Cocos, Malpelo y Las Perlas en Panamá y en Colombia, para poder establecer la necesidad de proteger regionalmente el recurso. Esto es algo que se está discutiendo y que actualmente el gobierno y la sociedad civil lo han puesto en manifiesto. El Ministerio del Ambiente, Cancillería, con sus discusiones con sus pares en Costa Rica, Colombia y Panamá. El gobierno, siendo parte de la Alianza Global por los Océanos, con Costa Rica y también anunciando su participación en ciertas instancias como la Alianza Latinoamericana para la Seguridad Alimentaria y la Pesca, ALPESCA, y otras, y la participación también dentro de la negociación del Bbnj. También se ha reunido con sus pares del Pacífico Sur, Chile, Perú y Colombia para discutir estos temas. Y la sociedad civil ha planteado una importante estrategia para extender la reserva marina de Galápagos, que tiene 40 millas, ¿no? 100 millas, bueno, este es un tema de negociación con el sector pesquero, con el gobierno y otros actores. Si uno mira en el contexto geográfico, la reserva marina que está bordeada en celeste es realmente pequeña, frente a la alta migración que tienen las especies del propio archipiélago de Galápagos con las otras áreas protegidas que tienen en la región del Pacífico Sudeste. Entonces, es importante esa visión regional también sobre el recurso y sobre todo para fomentar las capacidades de diálogo, de negociación y de cooperación de los países vecinos que estamos discutiendo este tema de la pesca ilegal, no regulada y no reglamentada en este lado del Pacífico. Por parte de la visión de Ecuador y de la legislación ambiental y constitucional que tenemos, el enfoque precautorio es algo que está inserto ya en la política de Estado desde la visión constitucional. El Estado tiene la facultad de aplicar medidas de precaución cuando haya peligro de extinción de especies o de destrucción de ecosistemas. Además, el Estatuto de Galápagos, la Ley Galápagos, y también específicamente mencionado a los principios como el principio de precaución cuando existe una grave amenaza de daño irreversible, a pesar de que no exista certeza científica. Es la característica del principio. Entonces, dentro de las herramientas políticas, constitucionales, legales y regulatorias, Ecuador ha avanzado en este propósito de conservación, específicamente de las islas. Pero es necesario ir más allá y la necesidad de coordinar dentro de la región actividades conjuntas, tanto dentro de los organismos de ordenación pesquera del Pacífico Sur como de la Comisión Interamericana de Atún Tropical, son importantes, a la vez de fortalecer las capacidades de monitoreo conjunta y fortalecer la cobertura y la protección con áreas de conservación más grandes, garantizando estos corredores marinos que tienen que darse para la efectiva conservación fuera de la jurisdicción de cada estado, donde el tema se vuelve más complicado. Ecuador, como parte de la Declaración de Nueva York, tiene capacidad de interponer algunas medidas y esto es, digamos, algo que se está conversando, inclusive en área diplomático con los países en cuestión. Pero más allá de lo que Ecuador puede hacer o lo que no puede en realidad hacer fuera de su jurisdicción, está el enfoque precautorio del derecho internacional, que como ya se ha mencionado, es parte del principio 15 de Río, está explícitamente aceptado en algunos instrumentos internacionales y definido como un principio de derecho internacional constitucionario en varias cortes, incluyendo también discusiones y opiniones consultivas del Tribunal del Mar. Entonces, es importante ponerlo de manifiesto porque hasta que exista un acuerdo intergubernamental para conservar los recursos marinos fuera de las jurisdicciones, tenemos que tener la capacidad de generar protección efectiva, siguiendo algunas acciones. La primera, lo que mencionaba de la cooperación regional de los estados del Pacífico Sur, como en el caso para Galápagos y Ecuador es Colombia, Panamá y Costa Rica. También Perú y Chile son países vecinos que tienen un enfoque sobre pesquería importante, con los que se tienen que tener medidas conjuntas. Participar activa y conjuntamente en las discusiones de la conferencia intergubernamental para la discusión del Bbnj. Es importante que Latinoamérica y los países de la región tengan visiones conjuntas. Es algo que a nosotros como estados nos cuesta mucho, pero es posible a través de esta visión compartida lograrlo, insertando el criterio de precaución, esta visión del enfoque de precaución en la sostenibilidad de los recursos, más allá de las jurisdicciones, en virtud de la alta conectividad y del impacto que tienen dentro de las jurisdicciones nacionales. La posibilidad de interponer medidas bajo el artículo 21 y 23 del Acuerdo de la Declaración de Nueva York, donde es posible inspecciones, cooperación regional y una serie de medidas que es necesario conversar. También por el lado comercial y dentro de lo que es otras organizaciones multilaterales, ser activos dentro de la Organización Mundial de Comercio en el grupo que discute subsidios a la pesca, que es un grupo que se estableció desde el 2001, desde la Declaración de Doha, y que tiene discusiones muy estancadas. Es hora de mirar el tema del subsidio, de la sobrecapacidad, porque esas naves que vienen en grandes flotas, más de 350 naves de esa capacidad, tienen una gran sobrecapacidad y un potencial destructivo enorme, y es a nivel comercial el espacio para discutir esa sobrecapacidad. Y a nivel de Galápagos, para terminar, el enfoque de precaución, si bien el Estado lo puede ejercer dentro de la jurisdicción de las islas, también es importante analizar el efecto jurisdiccional que requieren las medidas de precaución, de prevención del daño, para hacer efectiva la protección a este archipiélago y a las áreas marinas que el Estado pretende, habiendo cumplido y siendo signatario de muchas convenciones internacionales, que nos lleva a concluir con un llamado hacia la eficacia de los acuerdos multilaterales sobre medio ambiente en el tema marino, que requieren de medidas adicionales, que requieren de una mirada extrajurisdiccional y un alto componente de cooperación y coordinación entre estados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Maria Amparo, for sharing this disturbing story of Ecuador's efforts to protect the best known of all marine crown jewels, the Galapagos. You've shown us that while its biodiversity should be protected by the laws that Dr. Oral described, its recognition through the World Heritage Program, and the work that Ecuador has done to implement protections for sharks and other species of wild flora and fauna into its domestic law, there are still legal and enforcement limitations. You point to the need for improved enforcement capacity, but also traceability of fish, more consistent compliance by RFMOs with the FAO Code of Conduct, enforcement of geolocalization, and perhaps above all, international cooperation to manage species across national and international waters, including through regional protected areas such as the Corredor Marino Pacifico Oriental that you showed us, the Bbnj agreement, and the fishery subsidies negotiations at the World Trade Organization. We will be hearing more today about the connectivity of the ocean that you have introduced to our conversation, but I think it's also very valuable that you have pointed out the connectivity between international law and domestic law, between the law of neighboring countries, and finally, the connectivity between environmental law, trade, and financial law. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Evan Ellis, the Senior Non-Resident Fellow for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a research professor of Latin American Studies with a focus on the region's relationships with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors. Dr. Ellis has given testimony on Latin America security issues to the U.S. Congress on various occasions, and is cited regularly for his work in this area. He previously served on the U.S. Secretary of State's policy planning staff with responsibility for Latin America. Please, Dr. Ellis, share with us your expertise about deep water foreign fishing fleets. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to WCEL for the opportunity to be part of this very, very important event. My comments today really will, in many ways, I believe, complement those of Maria Amparo in emphasizing really what is happening, especially in the Western Hemisphere, empirically, and the way in which this really is, as a legal challenge and also a socioeconomic challenge, something that affects really the entire region in many different ways. And so with that, I am going to pull up a brief presentation. And so as always, please bear with me as we do this. You should now be able to see the presentation as soon as it comes up. Okay. So let me provide a little bit of context empirically. Obviously, the legal issues have always been there for Latin America, but one of the things that really made this problem become acute in about the past 20 years in Latin America is the expansion, the growth of China and the associated appetite. If we start on the other side of the Pacific, what we see is that the Chinese deep water fleet began focusing in some of their traditional areas, Bohai, Shaoshan, the South China Sea coast, the Gulf of Tonkin. And in many ways, overfishing there caused the collapse of those fisheries. In the past 30 years, we began to see the Chinese deep water fleet, among others, expand greatly and begin to focus in Africa. About 64% of those efforts are in Africa. But really in the past 10 years especially, that fleet expanding in size. Some estimates put it as much as 17,000 vessels. And of course, that, but not only the Chinese deep water fleet in Latin America and the Caribbean. The challenges have been already mentioned. Overfishing, which includes not only in EEZs, but also those activities which take place outside of EEZs, but because of the interdependence that Maria mentioned, leading to the collapse of fishing in general. Obviously, the catching of protected species, which I will mention, sharks and others. The use of various different types of practices, trawl nets, gill nets, etc., that not only catch the protected species, but also catch up other species in this. Pollution, including some of the liquids that are dumped, the plastics and things like that. and again, the entry into national EEZs and protected areas. One of the real damages that we've seen across the region is that from a socioeconomic standpoint, in Latin America, as elsewhere, the impact is often on the most vulnerable populations, small and artisanal fishing communities that really depend on these activities for their livelihoods. Also, as Maria Amparo mentioned, part of the difficulties in controlling these activities, obviously the legal question, but also, for example, the turning off of transponders and AIS systems. If you look at the lower graphic, for example, this again was taken from the Galapagos using the taking a look at GIS. But what you see is oftentimes the broken transponder tracks that the ships will turn off their transponders when they go into the EEZs. There was an interesting study recently done by an organization in the United States, which correlated radio frequency detection with the AIS systems, and actually located many of these ships within the EEZs. Now, that is not legal proof of illegal fishing, but it gave an idea of really the extent of what was going on. One of the other problems is the transferring of catches. Many years ago, states such as Chile began to forbid Chinese and other fishing fleets from making port calls, and there were increasing concerns over the legal liability of ships that were associated with problematic or illegal activities. But as some of the members of the deepwater fleet just stay out and are refueled and offload their catches to other tankers and other types of ships, the ability to enforce against those ships when they really never come into port for inspection or other activities becomes difficult. And indeed, a study of the Pew Research Foundation recently calculated that of the ships that it examined, and this was specifically the Chinese deepwater fleet, only perhaps about 1 part in 12 of the catch was actually reported. Another thing that begins to happen as national coast guards try to enforce their exclusive economic zones is that this introduces new types of dangers. There's a case we'll talk about in Argentina just a couple of years ago, which really illustrated this. Many of the ships cooperating together. In this particular case, there were about 5 ships which basically sought to elude, make it back out of the EEZ before being captured, and really almost led to a crash and the sinking of an Argentine Coast Guard vessel. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Maria Amparo also mentioned some of the challenges with national coordination. One of the critical issues also is coordination with respect to port calls. For example, Uruguay, which is certainly a nation of laws, but does not have a threat which is as grave in terms of the protection of its EEZ as, for example, neighboring Argentina. Many of the deepwater fleet ships that engage in activities outside and sometimes in the Argentine EEZ will then put into port in Montevideo or La Paloma. And recently, there was a project by a Chinese-based firm, Shandong Baoma, to look to the construction of a very large new fishing port, Punta Yergas. The difficulty is that these types of investments represent important economic opportunities to the host nations, and so to balancing, turning away the opportunities for those types of port calls and activities, while at the same time participating in a system of shared enforcement of international laws. Some of the other difficulties with enforcement include the inadequacy of national assets. So, for example, the Argentine Navy and its ability to stay out on station in its very large EEZ and its very long coastline is very limited. Also, while there is some monitoring, when ships explicitly turn off their AIS systems, their transponders, the ability to actually protect the EEZs in real time and monitor them against specific ships becomes very complicated. Also, as Maria Amparo mentioned and others mentioned, the legal issue of really enforcing national responsibility for the action of the fleets, especially when certain government representatives explicitly deny that their fleets do anything wrong, and difficulties sometimes in international cooperation in really identifying the ships and entities that are doing wrongdoing. We talked about the law outside the EEZ. I should also mention once again that this has been in the Western Hemisphere a problem that affects some countries more than others, but really is a broad and complex problem across the region. Argentina, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Colombia, Mexico have all experienced significant difficulties in one way or another. I won't go into detail in each of the cases, but I want to touch on a few of the details in a few, just to illustrate the magnitude and the breadth of the problem. So again, when we look at the Argentine case, I begin with some cases from 2012, just to illustrate that this is not something new. This has been happening for quite some time. I mentioned again before the case in 2018 of the Jingyuan 626, which again, it was for the Argentine Coast Guard a notorious case because again, it was almost like a bad movie. The very dangerous chase in which 5 Chinese deepwater ships attempted to basically block each other to allow them to escape from the EEZ, illustrating some of the very risky things that happen in these things on high seas. It's not just a legal issue. It almost becomes a security issue. Of course, the famous case in Argentina, March 2006, with the accidental sinking by the Argentine Coast Guard of another Chinese boat, the Lu Yuan Yu, in which, again, maneuvering to try to escape its incursion into the EEZ, it began to list and took on water and sank and had to be rescued by the Argentine Coast Guard. But in that case, it became a political economic issue for the newly inaugurated Mauricio Macri administration, because in many ways, it was the sinking of the ship, which was accidental, was linked to the question of the future tens of billions of dollars of Chinese investment that was going on or could go on in the country. In the January 2020, again, just recently, and this is another type of illustration, the Hua Li 19, another Chinese deepwater ship. This was a successful incident of international cooperation, but one that is all too rare. So, for example, this was a ship that had been identified by Chilean authorities as engaging in illegal activities in Chile, had passed through the Straits of Magellan, which is relatively common for these, had gone in and also participated in illegal fishing in Argentine EEZ. And so it was the Argentine authorities that actually stopped it, but tied it back to the illegal fishing in Chile through Interpol. So again, sometimes there is effective international legal cooperation, but sometimes it is a rare case. Maria Amparo talked about the Ecuador case, the 2017 case, and the 2020 case. Just a few more comments on these cases. In 2017, the only reason that the Fuyang Yu Leng 999 was detected was because one of Ecuador's 2 submarines popped up in the middle of the Chinese fishing fleet and surprised them. It actually found over 300 ships at the time, much like the current situation. And it detained one ship, finding 300 tons of illegally obtained fish. And in many ways, that one ship was prosecuted as an example. But we really weren't talking about one ship. We're talking about hundreds of ships that do these activities. And again, we have the current situation. And as Maria Amparo mentioned, the types of problems were illustrated by Ecuador's very educated and respectable defense minister, Osvaldo Jarin, who mentioned that about 1/2 of all of the Chinese vessels being monitored on the edge, and you see it here in the graphics that were supplied by a company that monitors these things, About half of the Chinese fleet had breaks in their AIS coverage in the vicinity of the Galapagos and were largely believed to be entering the EEZ. In Chile, and this is an important case, Chile, like Argentina, has a long coastline. Its navy is somewhat larger and more capable of patrolling its EEZ, but it's still an enormous problem. We see the international connectivity between the fleets in that in the current situation, many of the ships in the deepwater fleet, after going from the Galapagos, moved south along Peru's EEZ and is now actually in Chile's EEZ with a lot of news coverage in each country, a lot of attention to this. But it's interesting that, again, Chile, like Argentina, the reported cases in the news go back many, many years. So this is an ongoing problem. But also, we talk about protected areas. So Chile established a very important protected area, the Nazca Desventuradas Maritime Park. It expanded it in 2017. And only during this brief time, it has registered 22 definite violations. So again, just indicating that this is not just a Ecuadorian problem, it's a Chilean problem, it's a Mexican problem, etc. Two final cases, very briefly, and again, without going into detail, but in the Colombian case, it's a little bit unique because of the way in which the curvature of the geography of the Pacific affects the EEZs. Colombia's EEZ is a bit harder to access than some of the others from the other side of the Pacific. But here we find, and Maria Amparo mentioned very briefly the cases protected area around Malpelo and Yurupari with hammerhead sharks and other types of species. But again, if you look at the lower graphic there, you see the same type of worrisome behavior. Ships, at least officially, being at the edge of the EEZ and then broken transponder signals. And the final case, again, Mexico also has had many similar problems, but I want to use my mention of the Mexican case to illustrate some other types of problems. One is the cross impact on different species. So, for example, in the Sea of Cortez, between Baja California and Maine, Mexico, you see one problem is that, especially in China, a type of very large fish called totoaba, you see it there on the left, that fish that's taller than the fisherman. Its swim bladder is greatly desired. It has a cocaine-like effect, and so it's considered very exotic. What happens, but in the course of the illegal fishing that has pursued the totoaba, another type of fish that's in the area that tends to swim in the same area, and you actually see right there what's called the Vaquita Marina, loosely translated, as a small marine cow. You see a picture in the top. It looks like it's a small porpoise. You see a dead one with the children there. That species has been driven near to extinction because the nets used to catch the totoaba end up catching it as well, which have much less value to the Chinese and others. And another issue is in Mexico, these are areas that also are controlled by organized crime groups. And there's a lot of corruption involved for local officials looking the other way, these type of activities. Indeed, there was recent legislation in the Mexican Congress controlled by the Morena movement to perhaps take responsibility away from Mexico's fisheries enforcement organization, CONAPESCA, and actually give it to SAMAR, the Mexican Navy, although that hasn't gone forward yet. So the real idea here is to show how this comes together, the empirical activities of not just Chinese, but many others, the difficulties in enforcement, the impacts on species, overfishing, how these are all reinforcing and interconnected dynamics. And so with that, those are my remarks, and I look forward to participating with my colleagues in the Q&A that comes after our presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evan. We appreciate this deep dive into the enforcement complexities and also some of the possibilities, perhaps, of well, some states may be willfully uncooperative, some potential for cooperation between states to protect their shared ocean resource. Our next speaker, Christina Gerda, is the Senior High Seas Advisor for the Iucn Global Marine Program. She's also an adjunct professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, California, and a steering committee member for the High Seas Alliance, which is an umbrella group of civil society that works chiefly on the Bbnj agreement. For almost 30 years, Christina has worked on the progressive development. She started very young, of public international law relating to the marine environment, including the high seas and international seabed area. In addition to leading IUCN's delegation at numerous international ocean meetings, Christina has co-founded multiple cross-disciplinary initiatives and co-authored more than 150 publications. She will talk about the importance of ocean connectivity, which is actually really fitting because one of the hallmarks of Christina's work is that she has been a connector for so many people working in this area and has brought so many aspects of the law, the science, the policy together. And she's going to highlight the important role of marine protected areas, marine protected area networks, and protected migratory corridors for biodiversity conservation. Christina, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Simi, for those kind words, and thank you all for those, the organizers, to bring us here today. I'm also going to try to share my screen here and give you a presentation on the connectivity to sort of help you see some of the issues that we are confronting. That we know the ocean is important, but sometimes we stop thinking about what our connection is. And I love to use this photo of the cosmic jellyfish that helps to remind us that we need to be looking ahead, behind, and around and into the future if we're really going to make our way forward in this changing ocean together. What I'm going to try to do today in my brief time is to describe and build on the talks that have gone before as to how this Bbnj agreement, short for the International Legally Binding Agreement for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, how it can really serve as a vital tool for strengthening ecological and institutional resilience, global cooperation and coordination, in the hopes that we have coherent outcomes with respect to the building blocks of the Bbnj agreement on marine protected areas and other area-based management tools, environmental impact assessments, and strategic environmental assessments. How do we build a platform for ongoing consultation, coordination, to enhance our access to data and technology that we need for better managing our ocean commons? And how do we build upon existing ocean science to create those new tools that are really going to have an enabling impact for all? So for that, I'd just like to again go into how the ocean is connected, interconnected. We all have our feelers out, but it's this map visualization that was put together now 10 years ago as one of the final products of the Census of Marine Life that served for me to encapsulate how many ways we are interconnected. The global science cooperation that was supported through the Census of Marine Life, and now we hope in the coming decade, the decade of ocean science for sustainable development, enabled the development and application of these new tools for for tagging and tracking the movement of individual animals across ocean space. We made them into our own oceanographic monitors. We started to understand the environmental conditions they need in order to thrive, in order to find the food and where that food is going. So these thin yellow lines and orange lines and red lines are really individual animals, helping to drive home the message of how interconnected our ocean planet is. And of course, we have a whole host of new species remaining to be discovered. Thus, and as we all know, and is continuously emphasized by our previous speakers, the ocean is under stress. I was quite taken by this photo of the Laysan albatross, that there is one named Wisdom that is going to be 70 years old this coming year, 2021. You think of the ocean changes that she has seen in the ocean that's covered in plastics, the ocean that is denuded of the fish, including the squid she needs to feed her young, the chemicals, the plastics, the ghost nets, and the fishing gear that are now obstacles on her way to continue the ability of the species to survive, let alone to thrive. But as we go forward, we can see that we're all facing that challenge of putting together a coherent vision of what it is we want to see in the future ahead. We're working through an international legal structure and regime founded in the 1970s, earlier than that in many ways, and tinkered with at the edges. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea envisaged this obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment and the duty to conserve high seas living marine resources, but it has allowed a system to develop that focuses through the regional fisheries management organizations only on the fisheries resources and not the rich biodiversity that really belongs to the global community as a whole. So we're hoping we can use this new Bbnj agreement as a chance to bring all players to the table to enable ongoing cooperation coordination in order to create some more coherent outcomes. One of the issues that concerns me about the focus on illegal fishing is we also have the challenge of unassessed fishing. That's unassessed fishing when you don't know what you're fishing. You have no data about the reproductive patterns, the history, the interconnections of species like squid. Are you really just fishing in the dark? We know that Humboldt squid have been fished, jumbo squid, if you like, have been fished in the Southeast Pacific and many other parts of the ocean since the 1990s. But it was only this year that the South Pacific RFMO adopted the first conservation measure that only requires data reporting and collection, the implementation of vessel monitoring systems, and a small 5% observer coverage. That's not enough to know what the bycatch is. That's not enough to be able to manage squid as part of a critical ecosystem, that the squid are food for many other species, including the commercially important tuna. So as moving on, what is the role for the Bbnj agreement? Well, one, I like to think it provides us with a global level perspective on what is going on in our ocean. It can build resilience in our ecosystems and species by providing those islands of protection through marine protected areas to help support the genetic diversity that enables adaptation to a changing ocean. It increases the population size and creates those big mamas that are actually the ones that are the most fertile, and hence enhancing more resiliency and stability on the ecosystems itself. They're a vital tool for building climate resilience as well as for enabling the restoration of many diminished populations. But it's also a vital tool, the Bbnj agreement, for integrating biodiversity, for mainstreaming biodiversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity has a wonderful article about in situ conservation. And yes, it calls for interconnected systems in marine protected areas, but it also calls for mainstreaming biodiversity into our sectoral activities, including through strategic and national action plans and programs. Can we not do that for areas beyond national jurisdiction, at a national level, at a sectoral level, and at a regional level? Start to understand the interactions of our activities on biodiversity as a whole. And of course, we know that our ecologically significant areas and species do not spend all their time within one small circle of an exclusive economic zone or one area of an ecologically or biologically significant area. So these are areas on this map that have been described by the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And as you can see in the change of colors that depict whether they're totally within one jurisdiction or shared by multiple jurisdictions, no nation can really manage its own extended transboundary ecosystems alone. We truly need that global scale cooperation. So where are we now in the Bbnj agreement? Well, Simi already laid this out on the table about the package deal, about the 4 meetings that were supposed to have ended this year, and now we're in limbo, if you will, headed towards hopefully a fourth and final meeting in 2021. Yes, it is a package deal. All of these elements need to be treated as a whole. We are committed to not undermining existing institutions, but this gives us an opportunity to strengthen their capacity, their interaction, their knowledge base in which to act. And yes, we're trying to secure wide participation so those who are not fully part of the system can see the benefit for themselves. There is a draft text already. In fact, there's a revised draft text that is already under ongoing discussion. The reason I put this slide of the various articles is to show that international cooperation coordination are built into the system for deciding where MPA should go, how they will be protected, and bringing in all important players and the international community into these discussions and consultations. We need a global voice for biodiversity that also brings along all the other players with it. Similarly, in environmental impact assessments, normally they're just project level, site specific, they're done, they're routine, and they're filed. We have a chance through the Bbnj agreement to truly provide best practice guidance and standards to improve the outcomes of our environmental impact assessments. We have the chance for engaging all stakeholders, including those in the international community who have a stake in the health of these ecosystems, and a chance for ongoing international review and consultation. Strategic environmental assessments are that step up that help to inform environmental impact assessments, but can also help to lay the groundwork to understand what the impact may be of a new plan or even a new technology or a new gear type before it is introduced into the marine environment. It's an early and effective way to integrate biodiversity concerns into new activities. And then where many nations are going already, and many regions, hopefully, is that joint cooperation for better understanding where your regional ecosystems are headed. They're doing this in the North Atlantic and South Atlantic basin, and I'd be really excited to see this go forward as part of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development throughout all of our ocean basins. And then finally, getting towards the important roles for data and technology, science and innovation. As we've seen, this is the time when we need full maritime domain awareness. This is a technical term for basically understanding what is going on behind you, ahead of you, above you, and below you. Can we send out those tentacles like these jellyfish to better understand and communicate our knowledge of the ocean and how it is changing? Because we know the ocean is changing. We have already seen that in studies from many years ago, that fish are migrating, and with it, their ecosystem, their food, will that migrate at the same time. The northern fisheries may become more diverse. The equatorial fisheries are actually losing diversity, losing resilience, and losing abundance. Can we use marine protected areas as a tool to enhance their ability to adapt and to withstand the added pressures of climate change? We need better science. We need better science because we are understanding where the footprint of fishing is going now through efforts like the Global Data Watch, which is these areas, these colors in bright orange. We can now overlay them with areas of ecological or biological significance, small scale or large scale, as is in this map. Thank you. Satellite tracking, as we've been hearing about, can truly help us to better monitor fishing effort, i.e. fishing transshipments. But I'm excited that satellite monitoring can also help to integrate the species migration patterns into there so we can better understand where fishing can be, where it can't, where it may interact more with vulnerable species in order to all benefit. Here's an example of what's being done in California to integrate technologies for identifying where whales are, blue whales, humpback whales, right whales, that we can really find a way to enhance and progress together towards ecosystem-based management. Many of you have seen these studies before. Vessel monitoring system, IAS, is already being used to better understand how effective MPAs are. But I'm excited because it also helps to document why we need international collaboration, why individual RFMOs are not enough, because many fishing vessels go from one part of the ocean to another. They traverse through 3 different regional fisheries management organizations, as well as multiple EEZs. We need global scale cooperation if we are going to better understand and cope with fishing fleets that are still, some are not complying. And industry is on board too. There are more and more responsible fishers who are finding that it's better to communicate that level of information, transparency, that can actually help boost their salability of the supply chain. So I think it's time to get active, time to move forward. We're seeing the benefits of global cooperation for monitoring, control, enforcement, for fisheries, as well as for biodiversity conservation, protection, and its ongoing sustainability in our shared ocean. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'm hoping you've understood better how this Bbnj agreement can both enhance ecological resilience and institutional resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. This is a wonderful tour d'horizon for the Bbnj agreement. You've shown us how connectivity matters across all levels. You've brought climate into the discussion, which is important. You've also shown us where there's this wonderful opportunity for new law that can help address the problems we've been discussing. And of course, we have to remember what we've heard from previous speakers, that there has to be true national commitment to uphold the obligations and the commitments that states make when they agree to treaties. We still need monitoring, we still need enforcement, we still need compliance. It's my pleasure now to turn to the audience and to put forward some of the questions that you've posed. And I thought that it might be nice to start with one question about, let's see. Sorry, I have to manage a jumpy sheet here that has the questions. This is for Robert. What are new percentages of protection? What do you expect them to achieve, especially if more sustainable management is needed in certain areas? You might help us understand why marine protected area is useful from the perspective of the World Heritage Convention.
Well, first of all, normally a requirement for World Heritage listing in the marine context is that World Heritage properties are already a marine protected area. So normally that box is already ticked off. When it then comes to monitoring, then of course the World Heritage Committee, throughout its request of the past 40 years, has made specific recommendations to increase resilience. It can be, for example, when it comes to fishing, the example we just saw of the Phoenix Islands protected area, that was also a request from the World Heritage Committee. So there was a lot of support in making that happen. There are other sites where there is specific requests for partial no-take zones or fisheries regulations. So in that sense, I'm not going to go into detail now of all the marine sites where this has happened, but we can share the links afterwards. Even the Gulf of California was inscribed on the list of World Heritage in danger. last year, especially for the issues that my Dr. Evan Ellis highlighted. So in that sense, it helps with the World Heritage designation, helps to bring those local problems to the international arena and leverage more support and attention, if it's the marine protected area regulations or others, for finding solutions.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on that? Another question is directed to Maria Amparo, though others may want to comment also on this one. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the economic insecurity of nearshore MPAs and fisheries-dependent coastal populations. Can the concept of OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures, be used to expand regional networks of sustainably managed exclusive fishing zones for small-scale fishing communities?
Thank you, Simi. Well, I think that is a challenge, and Ecuador, on top of COVID-19 crisis and pandemic, we are also facing a very hard economic crisis. So many industries, and fisheries, one of them, are trying to gain momentum since they have been performing well, and trying to build strong value chains, and as I mentioned, even getting into new areas. But that what the person that made the question just stated is very important. It's very hard to build strong and resilient fishing communities. The scale is a problem. Fishing requires quite a lot of investment, and we still need to work on the scale and how to build the value chain that reaches the small fishermen in the islands, and provide them also with safe environments that do not harm the marine ecosystem, but that provide them with enough so they can survive. But the fishery industries is also getting into some technological responses. It's been working. We have to say, we have to be fair. They have been working recently on improving the materials to avoid plastics in the nets, and many other initiatives. They've been working with some NGOs like WWF or so. But we are beginning. This is something that is very new in Ecuador. We are still beginning the work to make our fishery industry better, to enforce the code of conduct, more transparency, traceability with throughout the chain. But also we need to look out for the small fishermen communities in the borders, and especially in the islands, to keep them alive, but also value and assess their impact as well.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Evan, would you like to also comment?
Yes, just very quickly, and I'll address this not as a lawyer, but as a political scientist. And I've been doing some work on the impact of COVID-19 on the regional economies. And I recognize that what the person making the question raises is really a very, very difficult issue, because it goes really not only into the legal range, but COVID-19 has forced reduction in budget in non-essential areas, especially outside of the combating the virus. And so unfortunately, many of these very important initiatives in fisheries communities and things like that make sense over the long term are coming under severe budget pressure now. In addition, you have the need for foreign investment and you're looking to, for example, countries like China for fiscal assistance. So, for example, Ecuador, as it has been engaged in the enforcement and in the Galapagos, also just negotiated a new $2.4 billion line of credit with the Chinese to to confront, as Maria Amparo addressed, a very delicate fiscal issue. And frankly, also one of the difficulties with fishing communities is that traditionally, when there's competition for resources, they have not been communities in Latin America that have had a strong voice for demanding these resources. So this is a very, very serious issue that the question raised. So thank you.
Thank you so much for helping us unpack the effect of the pandemic on these issues. Would anyone else like to comment on that particular question? Okay, thank you. There's another question that might be for you, Christina, which is also around this question of management, asking how much do we know about how much of the fishing that's being done in international waters as contrasted with the amount of overspill effect at the marine protected areas? And is there a time projection for our oceans to resist such exploitation if the trend continues?
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that right now, but I do know some colleagues are working on some scenario studies about the trajectory of climate change and its impact on the future of fisheries and the benefits of marine protected areas. So all I can say is stay tuned, and it should be soon available. Thank you.
Then I think we have quite a few questions about how to manage the illegal fishing aspects. So maybe we can move from management to more enforcement type questions. So let's start out with one for you and I, Niloufar, about what role, and for Christina as well, what role are the IUCN commissions playing in combating the illegal fishing, IUU fishing? I get to ask the question, so you get to answer. Niloufar, do you want to start, and then maybe Christina?
Yes. Well, I can. Why don't I just give the specific example of the role that the IUCN and WCEL played in participating in that landmark advisory opinion before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea concerning IUU fishing. And this was another very vulnerable region, West Africa, where they are losing billions of dollars of economic revenue. As Evan said about artisanal fishing, the impact there, piracy. So this was really an important step taken in terms of highlighting the responsibilities and liabilities of states. So the IUCN, Simi, myself, and we had some other colleagues as well. It was a team. And I think that it was an important opportunity for a very large conservation organization to feed into this process of what we call interpretation and lawmaking. And also, I know there's a question about the Congress. I think it's from Scott about the motions. So the IUCN and the Commission, every opportunity, I think we've already gone over the Bbnj, influencing every opportunity to influence policy and lawmaking, we are there. But I think we have to also realize that there's a limit to what the IUCN can do. I mean, we can promote, we can influence, we can build awareness, educate, but ultimately it's going to come down to states and industry to really implement these actions. So I'm just going to stop there and let Christina put in her thoughts on this.
Well, thank you. I've had the fortune of wearing both the WCEL and WCPA hats. And through WCPA, we've been working for a long time on how do you develop the tools to better manage marine protected areas. And that has, of course, led to this tagging and tracking work, which was ongoing, but be able to connect that to the high seas negotiations. But also that article where I was talking about the use of satellite vessel tracking data for empowering high seas governance. That was done through collaboration with members of the World Commission on Protected Areas and Global Fishing Watch, is seeing the potential of these tools that are being developed out by civil society or collaboration with governments for empowering and improving high seas governance. I would say, what we're seeing is you can improve your enforcement both domestically and high seas by understanding where these vessels are going, and then utilize the Port State Measures Agreement to enforce when these vessels call on national ports. You don't need to have huge navies on the high seas or boarding capacity on the high seas in order to enforce the international laws when they return home. If you can find them in a port, they can no longer hide. So I think that's important work. Thanks.
Thank you both. Robert.
Just also to highlight that, although I'm not working for IUCN, but we often closely work together with the IUCN World Heritage Program. So just like the UN, I think IUCN is a big house with many rooms. So there is a dedicated World Heritage Program that is all the advice from that goes from Unesco to member states to sites. That is, of course, backed up by the scientific advice from IUCN, which is the official advisory body to the World Heritage Convention. There are regularly there are missions, so there are dedicated missions from IUCN experts. I think to Galapagos there was a mission, I think 2 years ago. All those reports are also available with specific recommendations that the committee then endorses or requests, for example, Ecuador to work on. So there are specific missions. There is, of course, the decisions from the World Heritage Committee are also based upon advice of IUCN. And so this is a small dedicated team, World Heritage Program, that they also work together with many of the IUCN commissions in specific countries who often work closely already with management authorities of World Heritage sites. So a really big influence there, not often very visible maybe, but very, very important.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the point you're making, Robert, about the contribution that IUCN experts make to lots of organizations, including CITES, of course, where it's IUCN that comes up with the list of species. My first exposure to IUCN many, many years ago was realizing that there was this vast network of people who provided pro bono scientific advice for these kinds of things, then to learn that there were legal advisors as well, and then to get to know the staff at IUCN who are remarkable experts in their own right. It is a big house, and that doesn't even include the representatives from our state members who play an important role. So thank you. There was another question which I think Nilufer alluded to, and this is so IUCN's quadrennial meeting has also been postponed, but it's hovering in the future. And at that, there will be resolutions. And one question was, should there be a mandate to the commissions that is more narrowly focused on any of these issues? That's a question I'll proffer, see if anyone's interested in taking it, including possibly a member of our leadership who may be participating. Okay.
All right. I'll just jump in just to say that I think that it is important to highlight the role of the IUCN General Assembly and the motion process, and how those motions can have, definitely impact on the development of measures, law. And so I would say that there is absolutely space to have something more specific on this. And in fact, I think also to look at it, we touched upon this, but I think we really need to, and the IUCN can play a role here in the transnational criminal aspect as well, in terms of looking at it, not just its conservation, but conservation also linking with these other issues. So I would say yes, just briefly.
Thank you. We'll look forward to that then. Hopefully people will be listening and they'll And it's also worth saying that IUCN's programs are constrained to some extent by what our members are interested in and excited about. So we welcome that. So I'd like to turn to some of the questions. There were quite a few questions, in a sense, expressing frustration, I think, that you have posed these enforcement concerns. And so they sort of reiterate, well, how do we get better enforcement? So I think this is particularly on the enforcement tools, and then I'll have a separate question on the legal tools for you, Nilufer. But first, are there, of the choice of enforcement tools, Maria Amparo, Evan, do you see some that stand out as being particularly helpful? And it's sort of underscored in one of the questions that distant water fishing from maybe the dominant nation that has been pointed to for this, but from other nations too, threatens not just the Galapagos, but West Africa, which was, of course, the subject of the ITLOS advisory opinion that Nilufer described, North Korean waters, that there have been UN Security Council sanctions, and that there isn't a lot, only a few countries like the United States have real enforcement capacity. I think Christina suggested that the port state measures can be an effective sanction when it's fully employed, but we've also heard about transshipment at sea, which can undercut that. So what can you tell us? Maybe Maria Amparo first, and then Evan.
Well, I would like to respond to this question and probably link to one question that Christina is raising about trade and investment strategies, because I think we also should be looking at the problem through different perspectives, and we cannot forget that when we discuss illegal practices and we are talking about what is going on in the region, we are talking about a very important trade partner for the Latin American region, which is China. China is heavily investing in the region, in infrastructure, in a lot of industries, and is loaning money to our governments, so has a very important role. And we also should be looking at the diplomatic level, jointly and regionally, to be able to have a joint perspective within the Bbnj, of course, negotiation, but also with our trade and investment strategies towards China. And specifically one under WTO, I think we should be expanding the scope of the discussions under the subsidies group, fisheries and subsidies on fisheries under WTO, but also individually and regionally discussing about how are we enforcing our relations and what is the scope, because we're segmenting our interests, and we are not discussing when we're talking about financial aid, we're not bringing into the table what is the general relation with our partners, in this case Asian partners. So I think we should be looking at that as well. Here in Ecuador, it was raised throughout this event on Galapagos. How we should be addressing our relations with our partners, and we cannot rule out the fact that we need to call them and sit and negotiate and talk very bluntly and openly about the impacts and the relations we would like to have. We are selling fisheries to China now, as Ecuadorian industries are exporting shrimp, for instance, and growing very rapidly. So we have also the capacity to enforce some measures, or at least to put on the table the need to have environmental agreements, environmental measures and strategies in our trade relations. And I think that should be expanded and maybe brought into the WTO. We know that multilateral organizations are not working so well these times, but we need to talk regionally what kind of relations what kind of relation we would like to have with this important trade partner from the Latin American perspective, and be very bluntly and support each other as countries if we are sharing a common agenda for marine environmental protection.
And for my part, first, let me just thoroughly agree with everything that Maria Amparo just said. I think she captured the complexity of the commercial and the political relationship as part of the problem. Let me put out what I see as 5 promising elements to the solution, going from the tactical to the kind of the political. Number 1, tracking systems and more funding for tracking systems. I think part of the problem is that AIS in itself is not reliable in just building cases. And one of my colleagues also talked about some other promising things, but being able to track those ships, as we saw with some of the radio frequency detection, is a key element to building cases against individual shipping companies and ships. Number 2, I would say cooperation in the regional context. And so, for example, having databases about offending ships and cases and the companies that they are home ported in. Also, especially as we saw in the case of the cooperation through Interpol between Chile and Argentina that resulted in that one detention in Argentine waters. Again, the ability to build those cases, but often that is involving violations within EEZs and not violations on the high seas, which of course are the legal problems that my colleague spoke about. Number 3, cooperation by Latin American port states. And so again, I mentioned Uruguay and the issue of Montevideo, and basically ensuring that not only cooperation is enforced by those ships that come in, but an openness to resisting port calls, or at least making sure that laws are enforced. Ships that are engaged in activities outside of Argentine waters when they come into Uruguayan ports, for example. Number 4, what I would call, frankly, shaming. And there is a very complex relationship between very valuable economic investments and loans and things like that, and the deep water fleet. Let me be concrete. I am not arguing that China is openly responsible for the non-enforcement of actions of individuals, although one of my colleagues did talk about the broader legal obligation. But when we look at actions by the Chinese government elsewhere, for example, in Peru, in the mining industry, one of the places where there has been success is when the Chinese government and their Ministry of Foreign Relations recognized that the bad reputation of individual companies out of control would hurt China's broader image and China's broader investment success. And so I think there's a certain element of shaming that helping the Chinese government to see that reining in their deep water fleet more strictly is important to their broader advance in their commercial goodwill. And then finally, I would say that there's a broader issue of cooperation with China in general, and with others, but I would mention China specifically here in terms of, again, when there are legal cases that go back to ships registered in Zhongshan or other places, ensuring that there's the technical and political will to get full cooperation from complaints to actually track down those activities through China. I think there's more on the political front that can be done to strengthen that cooperation. So great question.
Great, thank you so much. So I think I have a specific question for Niloufar, which kind of segues from that, and then I'll invite each speaker to give a final concluding comment. So the question for you, Niloufar, is what are your views on the usefulness of the UNCLOS dispute settlement procedure in dealing with this? Would that be a realistic option for Ecuador or possibly other states claiming a violation of an obligation erga omnes partes?
Well, thank you, Simi. That's a great question. And I think the compulsory dispute settlement is woefully underutilized. And again, there is an opportunity, because that is one of the great benefits of the Law of the Sea Convention. It provides for compulsory dispute settlement, where you can, go to arbitration or ITLOS or ICJ. And it's not necessarily Ecuador that has to do this. I think we have to understand that, particularly we're talking about high seas areas, and the point of obligation erga omnes, not even inter partes, but erga omnes period, the universal interest of all states, means that another state can have standing, not Ecuador, but perhaps another state that is not under the same pressures as states. And it's not just China, by the way. There are some other states as well who are engaged in this type of unlawful fishing or unsustainable fishing, illegal fishing, whatever we want to say. So I think that there is definitely the opportunity, and again, I don't want to keep mentioning that the case, but it's important, the IUU case. There was an expectation that there would be a follow-up to that case, where the tribunal made very clearly what the obligations of states is, and importantly, the liability. And one thing I will add that was very important is that even one incident of IUU fishing can trigger liability. So that means that other states who are not necessarily Ecuador and Latin America, but technically you could get another state or a group of states to challenge this through the compulsory dispute settlement. So I think we need to do it. And I want to add as well, there are other mechanisms. I mean, we really have to look at it as multifaceted. It's interesting. The Law of the Sea Convention is about state responsibility, but you also have individual, criminal responsibility. And the Rome Statute, the prosecutor office is looking into the possibility of these types of acts that are depleting natural resources as possible crimes. Technically, I won't get into, there's certain problems with that. So I think there are opportunities to go through the legal dispute mechanisms, but we don't use them enough, frankly. So very briefly, that would be my answer, Simi, and I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well.
I do, but I will save them for another time. So we're really closing this wonderful session. I wanted to give you each sort of final chance to say something very briefly, if you care to. And maybe I'll invite you to do that in order that I see you on my monitor. So Maria Amparo, do you have some final words you'd like to share?
Very briefly, and I think everything that has been said here is so important, so relevant for our country, and to build up our position towards this kind of illegal fishing. And I will say that strengthening the relations within port authorities and the reports, the database, building a good database and exchange information, increasing transparency, the tracking devices and reporting, it should be a standard. It should be something that our Latin American countries in the South Pacific should be looking for and be very strict with that. The right cooperation and relations with countries in Asia, I think it's important to bring on the table everything that is on stake when we are increasing our investment relations and trade relations. I think we should be connecting the dots in having a whole agendas and not segmented agendas. And also to increase our national coherence in terms of policy measures. I think we should increase our cross-cutting measures. We all have problems within our economic zones, exclusive economic zones, with illegal fishing, unreported fishing. We still have to do a lot of work internally. So we still have homework. And as we are capable of gaining or doing our homework, we're capable of gaining credibility and making our position stronger and uniting. And finally, I think it's very important for our countries to be thinking towards the Bbnj as an important agenda that could unite us and undertake joint and regional cooperation challenges that I think could enforce or could allow us to enforce better our own obligations under many MEAs, but also to provide us capacity to fight this and to be able to bring out a perspective and put out a perspective and a voice of what should be this new agreement, as it was said by Christina Gerda, doing for the ecosystems and also for our own economies and security and food security in our countries.
Thank you. Christina.
Well, I just like to thank you for this opportunity to learn from all of these expert speakers, and just to stress that high seas fishing, overfishing impacts on ecosystems is an international concern, a regional concern, and a very local concern. But we can help one another to address some of these problems through global cooperation, especially and including through the Bbnj agreement. Dispute resolution procedures can be very expensive and sometimes often alienating for those that you may wish to target. If we can build some alternative dispute resolution procedures through the Bbnj agreement by creating that ongoing platform for cooperation through call-in provisions where you can question the decision or a pending decision of another state, and actually try to find a way to resolve some of these disputes before they develop into full-blown disputes and anger. Utilize those channels of diplomacy that we have at our fingertips and have a fine history of using. We just need to look again at the global perspective and what it can do to help solve some of these many challenges. Thanks.
Thank you. Evan.
First of all, just to emphasize a few key points. As I suggested before, first, that this is a long-standing problem. I mean, this has been going on in worsening. And when we look at the drivers of the overfishing, the expectation is that this will only get worse, both in the hemisphere and elsewhere. Number two, this is a regional problem from a Latin America standpoint. It's not just an Ecuador problem. It's not just an Argentine problem. It affects, the entire region. Number three, this is a political will issue as well as a legal issue. Number one, as I mentioned before, the difficulty in the most affected communities are often the ones with least voice. Number two, the understanding in politics in Latin America of the connectivity between overfishing, prosperity, and community security, I think is still very, very weak. Especially when you introduce issues, as we've talked about, investment, fiscal needs for, with states like China. Finally, I think there are some promising technical areas that can continue to be mined. One, I think there are, the more developed states, the US, Europe, and others can provide more assistance in areas such as governance, surveillance, collaborative enforcement activities, et cetera, et cetera. It would be nice to see levels of enforcement and assistance to the same level that we see in the United States with counter-drug cooperation. Also, this is a multilateral solution. Other Asian players were mentioned, but there are states such as Japan and Korea who have reasonably good records in terms of adherents who I think can be a part of this discourse and help to increase a more enforcement-oriented environment. Inclusion, as one of my colleagues mentioned, of this in international treaties, whether those are multilateral or others, making sure that this is codified into other types of law and not just, some of the excellent things that I, as a non-lawyer, have heard talked about here today. And frankly, the opportunity for sub-regional organizations, so in the Americas, the OAS, for example, or CELAC, or the BRICS, or Mercosur, to increasingly take this on as an issue in engaging China and in others, I think is a way of increasing the ability to basically enforce and also increase the will of other parties to provide that increased assistance. So I think there are solutions in the political as well as the legal front, but it's a problem that's going to be it's a grave problem that's only getting worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
First of all, apologies for my black white because I didn't calculate the sun was change of hour. So I think it's also clear that when something happens near a World Heritage Site, the world takes notice, and I think that's really one of the using that global recognition can definitely help. And if we want to ensure altogether, if we want to ensure that this unique heritage is safeguarded for future generations, it's going to be through international cooperation. So I think many of the speakers have highlighted this with concrete proposals. So I think we all have a role to play, whether it's now a UN agency, Unesco, Iucn, scientists, NGOs, and by playing our role really good and sharing information, I think that's how we can definitely progress.
Thank you. And Niloufer, you have the last word.
Thank you, Simi. It's hard to add anything to all the wonderful comments that my fellow panelists have made. But I think what's clear from this webinar and all the comments, as well as the questions, there's actually no one way. There's not a single way to approach this problem. It has to be approached from all different levels, whether it be, we said regional, global, local, whether it be through cooperation, through traditional enforcement. What we haven't addressed also is the demand issue. The consumer. I mean, the reason that we have this level of IUU fishing is the demand. We have to have a very broad strategy for this, because it is really a catastrophic situation that's looming. And again, I underline that it's depleting fish stocks, it's depleting marine life, but it's also impacting millions of people's livelihoods. So it's a very broad issue. But this webinar, I hope, is served to bring it again to the awareness of the global community. And so thank you very much to the organizers.
Thank you. This valuable discussion has advanced all our understanding of what's needed and the steps that the international community can take to sustain our ocean for future generations. We thank you in the audience for your attention, your questions, and your comments. You'll find a recording of this webinar and additional information on the World Commission on Environmental Law website, which you can find in the chat. The next webinar in this series will be Environmental Law in Africa. What is the role of civil society in environmental governance? The next we invite you to join us in these webinars and in our shared work on behalf of our ocean and our earth. Now, please join me in thanking all our speakers, our interpreters, the organizers, and our sponsors, the World Commission on Environmental Law, the World Commission on Protected Areas, and the Inter-American Institute on Justice and Sustainability. We wish you a good day or evening, as the case may be.